Hi guys, week 2, here we go. So these chapters that we're gonna work on now are dedicated towards getting you started on the ICD-10 book. Now hopefully, first of all, let me just say I posted in Blackboard 2 documents that I wrote, and they're really important for you to go through and read because it actually takes you through how to code step by step. So make sure you do everything and read everything that I give to you. So a couple things I want to say, and I'm going to keep repeating this, and I always do, even in the live classroom. I repeat the same thing over and over every week to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed. So coding, it's kind of like learning a musical instrument, right? If you're learning a musical instrument and somebody gives you this piece of music to play, when you start playing it, you're going to sound terrible. And you're going to keep practicing and practicing and practicing, and then you get it, and then you can play it beautifully. So coding is very similar. When I give you assignments to do in the workbook, you're not going to get them right. If you were able to get them all right, then there's nothing for you to learn. So coding is learning by practice. So when you tackle the exercises in the workbook, in all likelihood, you're going to run into problems. You're going to say, I didn't know how to find the code for this. I didn't know how to do it, or I got it wrong. That's how we learn coding. So I want to be really crystal clear on that because my son's telling me to smile. I want to be crystal clear on that because I don't want you to get frustrated. So remember that part. Okay, so here's your ICD-10 book, right? It looks something like this. It's big, it's huge. We're going to work with that for the first few chapters. We're going to learn how to use the ICD-10 book. Then we're going to learn how to use the CPT book, and then we're going to kind of work on putting them together. So remember, the ICD-10 book is specifically for diagnoses, why the patient is here, what's wrong with the patient, what do they have, what is their diagnosis, what is their symptom. That's what we're looking up, that's what we're coding here in the ICD-10 book. A couple things. In the ICD-10 book, and again, I put this in the documents that you're supposed to read, you're going to have kind of 2 parts to it. There's an index. The type is very small. That's where you look up the code. And it's a step 1, step 2 process. You look up the code in the index, and then you verify it in the tabular part of the book. And so again, all this is further explained in the documents that I wrote for you. So go through that first. This video is just kind of to drive the whole thing home. There's also in this book, I want you to get familiar with it. I want you to look at it. I want you to page through it. When you're actually coding, so there's a 2-step process. You look the code up in the index, you verify it in the tabular, but there's all kinds of guidelines. So I'll give you an example of a guideline. Let's say I come into the doctor's office with a urinary tract infection. So when you have a urinary tract infection, you go to your doctor, they tell you to pee in a cup, right? And then they look to see what kind of bacteria you have in your urine. So if I have a urinary tract infection, you're going to find urinary tract infection in this book. You're going to look up the code and find the code for urinary tract infection. However, for coding purposes, because coding is used both for data and statistical information, and it is also used for reimbursement, we want to know what kind of bacteria caused your urinary tract infection. That's a separate code. So one of the coding guidelines says if you have some kind of infection, you also code the bacteria that was identified, and that code is in here. So coding guidelines, that's just an example of one coding guideline. If you look in your book, usually in the beginning of the book, you're going to find a whole section on coding guidelines. And we're going to go through coding guidelines. We're not going to get too detailed into them. Remember, this is an intro to coding class, so we're going to keep everything on a basic level for this class, but we're going to go through some of these coding guidelines, further on week by week. So that explanation is really just to explain to you how this works. So there's all kinds of guidelines for all different things, and you can find the guidelines written here. We are going to go over them week by week, but as you go along, we'll talk about them more. There's also something that you're going to read about in your textbook, so it's really important that you read the textbook. Obviously, with an online class, all your independent work is everything. These videos are short. It's not the same as being in the classroom. That's not to say you can't learn everything, but you really have to read everything. And again, I said to you in the last video that some things in the textbook are going to get into great detail because some people are taking this class to pursue coding as a career. And then, you know, you don't have to, we're not going to get into tremendous amount of detail in this class. So don't worry if it's over your head, but you do need to read everything. There's also something called Z codes. And you'll see they talk about that in your textbook in your reading. And I'm just going to explain a little bit about Z codes to make it more clear. Z codes are used, so let's say you go to the doctor's office, and let's say you're just going there because you're having a physical exam, right? There's nothing wrong with you. There's no diagnosis. You're just going there to have a physical exam. That would be found under Z codes. So Z codes are used for circumstances where there's nothing wrong with the patient, but they're coming to the office or they're coming to the hospital. So a physical exam is one of them. Let's say you were sick and the doctor says, I want you to come for aftercare for surgery. Let's say you had surgery and the doctor says, I want you to come for aftercare. Aftercare is going to be a Z code. So there's a section of codes and they're called Z codes. And when you read in your textbook, you know, don't watch this video without reading in the textbook because you'll say none of this makes sense. When you read in the textbook, you will see that they explain fully about Z codes. Z codes are important to understand what their purpose is. So they're really for anything, again, that doesn't fall under a category of being a symptom or a complaint or a problem or a diagnosis. It's when you go to the doctor's office or when you go to the hospital for something like aftercare or like a physical exam. Also, when you read in your textbook, they talk about first listed diagnosis. So a person can come into the hospital or a person can go to the doctor's office and they can have a whole list of things wrong with them, right? You can go to a hospital or doctor's office and you can have pneumonia and you can have congestive heart failure and you can have diabetes, and that's not unusual, especially for older patients. And you are supposed to code all those diagnoses. You code all of those diagnoses, especially not just for statistical purposes, but for reimbursement purposes. If somebody has pneumonia, let's say, and they're in the hospital, and they have pneumonia with diabetes, congestive heart failure, COPD, versus the person, the 20-year-old person who comes in for pneumonia, which person do you think is going to cost more to stay in the hospital? It's going to be the first patient, right? Because they have all these other things wrong with them. So they're going to be monitored for those things. They're probably going to be given medication for those things. So when we talk about coding for reimbursement, we talk about coding and making sure that we list all the diagnoses that a patient might have. So when we talk about the first listed diagnoses, it does matter which one you list first. And the one that you're listing first is always why the patient is here. So let's just say a patient comes in. This is a very kind of weird, funny example, but let's say a patient comes in with pneumonia. And let's say during their hospital stay, they fall out of bed and break their arm, right? The first listed diagnosis, the reason they're there is going to be the pneumonia. You're also going to list the broken arm, but the first listed diagnosis is going to be the pneumonia. So the order of diagnoses matters, specifically the first one. And you kind of always, let's say if a patient has 10 diagnoses, you kind of want to list them by importance. So let's say I'm a patient who comes in for pneumonia. I also have congestive heart failure, and let's say I have ingrown toenails. You know, which one do you think is going to be last? The ingrown toenails, right? So you kind of list them by importance, but the first listed one, it really does matter that you're selecting the correct diagnosis to be listed first. Okay, so I'm going to come back to you with more videos, but really what I want you to do, before really watching the videos, is make sure you read the textbook. Really make sure you read those little documents that I'm writing for you, because that really does explain how to look up a code. And then these videos are hopefully to help make sure there's no confusion when you're reading. Again, if you have any questions or things you want to clarify, we'll have discussion boards on Blackboard that I'm going to post, and you can also email me and ask me questions. So read your textbook. We're going to play it by ear as we go along. Hopefully between the videos, the documents I produce, and your textbook, you're going to get the whole picture. If you feel lost at any point, don't hesitate to contact me. Okay, talk to you again soon.